Hi everyone, Mr. Spahitch here. I'd like today to talk to you in this video about some of the differences between emotions, which are more temporary in nature, attitudes, which tend to be longer held, and motivations, why people do the things that we do. And then what I'll do is I'll go through the notes briefly that are part of this blog. So as I had mentioned, attitudes tend to be longer held. So when you think about some of the isms, racism and uh, ageism, sexism, those tend to be longer held beliefs based on a variety of things, the way that the brain categorizes things in a crude but quick manner, whereas emotions tend to be more temporary in their nature. So those are some of the key differences between the attitudes versus emotions. Now, motivations, as you'll see as you read through, can be either internal. There's two main categories: internal, or the ones that come from within, versus external, when we're motivated by extrinsic things. So some people are motivated to do a task because of the money that they'll make. That's usually considered extrinsic. And if you do something because you really enjoy doing it, so maybe you volunteer at a shelter, you're not getting paid any money, that could be something that's an internal motivator because you're not getting any external reward out of that. Now, depending on the motivations behind why you do something, two people could do the exact same thing. One could be motivated by an internal reward that they feel, and one could be motivated by an external. For example, I know that I used to work for an organization where I got to know the person that I reported to really well, and it came to a point I didn't worry about losing my job if I had made a mistake. What I was, in fact, more worried about was disappointing this person who I'd gotten to know, and I wanted them to be happy with what I was doing. So, in a sense, it wasn't just because of the money, which is more of an external motivator. It was more the intrinsic value that I placed in this friendship that I had with them. And I know that even in parenting, sometimes children will do things to please their parents. Actually, a lot of the times they'll do that, and it seems to me to be very intrinsic in their nature. There is a question then about whether some activities are considered innate, as in being born with or genetic, versus things that we learn. Now, some things we learn. For example, children, really small children, infants, won't know what the value of, say, money is. That's something that over time we learn. We realize, depending on whatever culture that we're living in, that money can be of value because you can take that and then buy something that you want. So in the case of some of the external or extrinsic rewards through motivation, they're things that are learned over time, and we learn to be fearful of things. For example, somebody that's never seen a gun before is probably not going to be fearful of it, versus someone who's seen what a gun does, either in real life or through movies, television, things like that, will be more aware of what a gun can do. So if you brought somebody from a long time ago, from the past, and brought them to the future where they had never seen a gun before, they probably wouldn't have any fear of that until they saw what it was capable of doing. And that's because there's something there that's learned, versus things that are innate. They come automatically, and a good example of that would be something like a baby when it's first born knows to nurse off of its mother, and that's true with mammals kind of across the board. So you don't have to teach a puppy how to nurse off of its mom. It will just know how to do that. So that's an innate motivation, and there definitely are things in our lives that we are automatically accustomed to wanting to do, versus something that we would have to learn. And then I mentioned about some of the cultural influences and differences. These exist within our attitudes and emotions as well. So there are things that will motivate us because of a cultural aspect to it. And these things are important to recognize. And an example of this would be if you're watching somebody do something, and let's say they're giving you a thumbs up. Now, in a lot of cultures, that means you're doing good. I know water skiing means go faster, but in a lot of cultures, that means that you're doing something good. But in some cultures, it might not mean that, and it's important to recognize what some of these differences are based on culture. And in terms of understanding some of the things relating to that, it's good to realize why our brains will categorize things and put them into different categories in a kind of a crude, quick way. I know that the brain is probably one of the, I don't want to say maybe laziest parts of our body, in the sense that it's always looking for quick, efficient ways to do something. And I know when you're teaching math, it's good to show students, especially at the younger age, why 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 will equal 8. And the brain can add 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 and see that it will equal 8. And maybe you do groups of 2, 4 groups of 2. But eventually the brain, and good teachers work with students to figure this out, that there's a quicker way to do that. That if you group these together, and that you can move from addition into multiplication because of going through something like that. So you start with repeatedly adding 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2. But eventually you get to a point where you recognize that that number 2 is constant and that there are 4 groups of it. So you would eventually move into the idea that it's 4 2s, or 4 times 2, or 2 4 times, or 2 times 4. But that takes practice, and it does take the brain. Well, it's where the brain starts to recognize that there are shortcuts that can be taken, and this is where a lot of the quick formulas in math come from, and that is through the brain finding quicker ways to do that. I know as a construction teacher as well, I've seen students before where they will be in the shop and will be working on something, and they won't have the right tool next to them to do what they need. And rather than walking over to the cupboard, and I myself have done this myself, is let's say you have a small nail that needs to be pounded in, and it's the only one you have to pound in, and you happen to you have a wrench in your hand because you were just using a wrench. Somebody may use that wrench to tap that nail in, because your brain quickly decides, and it's all very quickly the way that this happens, is the brain looks at what's in your hand, the wrench, says this will work to hit this nail in, or I could put this down and go all the way back to the toolbox and pick up a hammer and then come back and hammer it in. But your brain is trying to find the quickest way to go about doing that. And that's why sometimes people use the wrong tool for the job. It's your brain's way of recognizing that something else will work, probably not as well, and then they're using that and going and finding these shortcuts. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Now, there are certainly downsides to this. One of the downsides, of course, is your brain, or the human brain, will find shortcuts around when we meet new people. And like when we're real young, we haven't met anyone yet, we're still forming the schema, and that forms all the way through our life. But the example I like to use is when we think about, if I say almost any word, you can probably think of something to relate to that. If I said school bus, you might come up with words like yellow and school and students, and you might come up with ideas about that. I might say banana, and like, well, how does a banana connect with a school bus? And in my mind, I go back to this episode of The Simpsons where they were racing an orange and a banana down the aisle. Well, Ralph Wiggum was racing a banana, and it just jumps into my head. Oh, banana, go banana, because they don't roll. So it's kind of funny. But if I was to say something like nuclear power plant, I know in class when I've done this activity before, very few people have a whole lot of knowledge about what a nuclear power plant is. I have a brother who works at a nuclear power plant, so I would say in discussions with him and watching videos, I know a little bit more about them than maybe your average person. But in class when I asked this, I've had students say Homer Simpson. So even, because he works at a nuclear power plant. So our brain has this ability to connect the dots between different things, and oftentimes we will imagine certain things before we even ever do them. For example, if you're going on a trip somewhere, you might imagine what it would be like going there based on other things you know about that area or that region. And this is often the case why people stereotype and discriminate against different things and people. When we do it against people in a way that relates to their ethnic origin, we call that racism. And this is something that can be damaging depending on where this information is coming from. There can also be gender discrimination. An example, I'll give you an example of that in a moment too. We also could have age discrimination or ageism. So I'm going to tell you a quick story, and I want you to try and work through this, and I'll give you a brief moment at the end to try to figure it out. It's a little bit of a trivia thing, but there was a boy and his father, and they went up north hunting. And there was an accident while they were on their way there, and 2 ambulances came. One took the father to one hospital, and the other ambulance took the boy to another hospital. When the doctor walked in and looked at the boy, the doctor said, "I can't work or operate on that boy. That's my son." And I want you to take a moment and think about it. How could that have been the case? How was it that the doctor couldn't work on the son? Who was the doctor? So you can pause and think about it if you want, but basically I'll give you the answer here. The doctor was in fact the boy's mother. Now, if you didn't get that right away, it could be because you may have an idea in your head of a stereotypical doctor, which when thinking about that, at least years ago, typically they were male. So if you were thinking about it from that perspective, you may have been wondering, well, if the father went to another hospital, how could he be there and working on his son? When in fact it was the mother, and we don't always do that. We don't always connect the dots. So if that wasn't in fact something you didn't get right away, it could have been because subconsciously you were thinking about the stereotype that a doctor is a male, and certainly in the past that was the case the majority of the time. There are still some occupations that are dominated by certain genders. As a teacher myself, I know in schools, I was actually at one school in the past where I was the only male on staff. Everyone else was a female. So this is an occupation which would have more females employed in it than males. If you looked at the construction industry and the trades in general, they tend to still be dominated by males versus females. So that can lead to people having stereotypes about things. And stereotypes sometimes are based on an element of truth. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be a stereotype. But what happens is when people have a stereotype about a certain group, whether it be that older people can't drive as well, which would be an ageism stereotype, or that black people tend to be better at basketball, that may be based on watching something like the NBA and seeing a majority of players tend to be black, and then connecting those in your mind to create a stereotype that exists. Most stereotypes tend to be negative. However, there are some that are more neutral or not even, maybe even positive, but the vast majority do tend to be negative. What can happen is if you start believing a stereotype to be true of, let's say, all people of one gender. So if you generalized and said all women are this, or all young people are this, or all people that are Caucasian or white are this, you start to enter into a realm of prejudging someone based on a group that they belong to, whether it's age or gender or ethnic background. And that's called that's a prejudice. When you start to believe that stereotypes are true for all people of a group. Now, what can happen on a ladder approach to racism? You start at the bottom rung, which is a stereotype, and sometimes people can poke fun at these. And I know that there are some comedians like Don Burnstick, for example, is a native comedian. Another one would be Russell Peters, and he's from Ontario originally. And Russell Peters has made a lot of his jokes over the years on stereotypes, and he grew up in a very multicultural area, so he had lots of friends of different backgrounds. He grew up not far from where I did. But what can happen is you can take stereotypes up to prejudice and start actually believing these things to be true. And the last rung, or the highest rung on this ladder, this racism ladder, I guess, you'd start at you'd start at stereotypes, work your way up to having a prejudice, and when you put those prejudices into power, you now enter into the realm of discrimination, and that's where you start to take action on these things. So you work your way up the ladder, and the higher you go, the more dangerous it can certainly become, because discrimination would be, for example, if you believe that a certain group of people were more likely to steal and you owned a store, you might start looking more closely at them or asking them to leave, or just not trusting them in the same way you would other people. So that's an example of discrimination. Now, I wasn't sure how to move this camera off without kind of moving it completely off the screen. So what I've got here is the document that you're going to be looking at next, and it is in the blog. So feel free to read through that, and when you're finished answering the questions that follow, you can send those to k.spahitch.eagle@gmail.com, and I will be able to answer them from there. We'll also discuss more of this in class.